Yes, they crave. Let's find out an every conversation explores the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. He's a futurist and market trends navigator, none other than Mr. Cameron Cowan. Welcome, Mr. Cameron, on Abstract
Hello.
Essay. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Yeah, so my name is Cameron Cowan. I do political and cultural commentary at CameronJournal.com. I have also a podcast. We're in audio and video on every of your favorite platforms. The Cameron Journal podcast, news hours on Monday, and I do a really fun show with my buddies every Wednesday called The Living Joke. So if it's being talked about, I'm talking about it somewhere.
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Mr. Cowan or Mr. Cameron. So today let's talk about the current market trends. So tell us if you had to identify a single most powerful force shaping market trends right now, what would it be?
Well, right now, obviously, the big shiny trendy topic is AI. That's what kind of everybody is talking about. I've watched most of the conversation about futurism and all that type of thing um, turn into really conversations about AI, and that's okay and very understandable. But I think the real trend that we're not talking about right now is geopolitics. The
Yes.
global order is shifting and changing for the first time basically since 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union, and certainly nothing that's significant since the end of the Second World War. And that is probably the most underrated reporting story, with Trump focusing more on North and South America in a very Monroe Doctrine sort of way. I saw a story this morning about parts of Canada wanting to join the United States. China getting more active in Asia. There's a rumor going around they're trying to build a new um, sub oceanic wall that will keep out American submarines. Everything is shifting and changing, as especially with the Trump administration making the moves that they've made in the United States. The whole world is kind of shifting around to a different order. Relationships are changing, trade deals are changing. The days of having a lot of goods made in other countries and shipped around the world is probably coming to an end. The order that made globalization possible is coming to an end. And that's probably the biggest story no one's really talking about right now, is the fact that a lot of the global economy is predicated on being able to make something cheap in China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and then send it to North America, Europe. That may not be practical anymore by the end of the decade. And that makes the future of products and consumer goods very interesting. And I laugh because I saw a post on Twitter this morning. Someone's like, if you're doing product development, you need to have a relationship in China. You need to be on all these malls and marketplaces. And I'm kind of like, that won't be true in 5 years. Literally, it won't be true in 5 years. So it's a very interesting time. So while everyone is focused on I would look at the planet. Things are shifting rapidly.
Definitely, yes. So, do you think this is good for us or it will break us?
It's going to be a mixed bag. It also depends on good for whom. um it will be not great for national GDP growth. um it will maybe not necessarily be so great for cost of capital. It will probably not be so great for companies whose business models are predicated on using cheap labor. It has the potential to be very good for workers, but we also are having demographic collapse pretty much everywhere. So that a lot of that new national production better be automated, because we won't have the humans to do it over the next 10 to 15 years. I had a guy on my show, Ron Hetrick, who thinks we're going to have a significant labor shortage by the end of this decade. And that's 4 years from now. Basically, we're in December of 2025. Um, but yeah, it's, I mean, there's a potentiality for it being good for workers and regular people. It's very bad for businesses whose business models are predicated on inexpensive labor, inexpensive products, all this type of thing. And I think the biggest reality, what I was probably going to make it difficult for everyone, is things are going to cost more, lifestyles are going to go down, and we're already seeing that. With people, people even in this country making six figures and above, being like, we're barely hanging on, we can't afford this, we can't afford that, all this sort of thing. And then you have, anyone below that is basically struggling, just with kind of housing costs alone. So, good or bad, it depends on who you are, sort of thing, and where you are in the ecosystem. But I think the big moral of the story is the lifestyles that we have been living over the last 20-30 years are not presently practical, and probably won't be moving forward. That's going to be a hard adjustment for a lot of people. There's going to be a lot of political fallout with that.
Yes, definitely. So, do you think, Mr. Cameron, we can easily adopt those things happening to us right now?
Well, I think some people won't have a choice, they'll be forced into it. There are other people who will figure it out. There's a lot of people who will complain, and you're already kind of seeing a lot of those complaints already. I think there's going to be a lot of a lot of places who, in this sort of regime, find that their whole country might not necessarily be as viable as they thought it once was. Someone told me a joke the other day in the Philippines that there was a small movement to get re-annexed by the United States, and I thought that was the funniest thing ever. But I also, if you're the Philippines and you're sitting in the Pacific, kind of in the middle, and you've got China on the one hand and the US on the other, where half the country lives anyway, because they all come here to work in nursing and all this sort of thing, it's kind of understandable where they'd be kind of like, this independence thing's not so hot. Let's just move back in, sort of thing. Everything's on the table. I mean, I think that's probably the craziest thing. Everything is on the table. 10 years ago, that would have been a laughable idea. Nowadays, it's kind of like, yeah, I could totally understand why some people would be kind of like, yeah, let's just rejoin. Because the reality is, in this shifting geopolitical environment, being on your own can kind of be a liability unless you're very strong. Other, it's like, do we get re-annexed by the US, or do we wait for China to come do it by force? You know,
By force.
well, and when we look to what's happening in Ukraine, that's maybe not such a distant possibility anymore. I've been saying for the last couple years, I have a master's degree in international relations, specifically in diplomacy. And when in grad school we talk about, the two or three conflicts that we most worried would happen that would destabilize the global order. And two of them have happened, interestingly enough. The only one that hasn't happened is China taking over Taiwan. But in terms of Russia invading Ukraine, that was something we always had feared, and now that has come to a reality. We had also, I at least, was always very worried about what would happen in the Middle East with a big collapse um in Palestine, and what would happen if we had strikes from Iran on Israel. We've lived through that as well, and lived through the development of that relationship. So the reality is the geopolitical order is changing, the world is changing, and everyone by hook or by crook is going to end up kind of getting used to that, and things that seemed impossible will start to make sense, like the annexation of the Philippines. So it's a very odd time.
Very odd time indeed. So, what is the most significant gap you see between prevailing media business narrative about the market and what is the underlying data is actually telling you?
I think the biggest disconnect is between the success in the stock market and what's really happening on Main Street. And you see this not just in the United States, but almost every developed country, where the stock market is reaching all-time highs. That end of the economy is doing very well, but people are skipping meals. They're struggling to buy food. They're budgeting on gas. They're not having children. flat out sort of thing. Um, that disconnect, people kind of ask, like, how can the stock market be doing so well when it doesn't seem like I'm doing well? Since COVID, the stock market valuations have not been tied to performance in the real world. That's late stage capitalism and financialization for you. Also, the reality is there are lots of parts of the market that are not necessarily dependent on Main Street. But I would also remind people that for the S&P 500, seven stocks, all in tech, all to do with AI, is where all the growth is. Same thing for Nasdaq. If you take out those seven tech stocks, the stock market would be flat or declining this year, which basically means it's a symbol of our new K economy. There's a small part doing fabulously well while everyone else is flat or going down. That disconnect, where you have a small part of the economy doing very well and people have no way to get a part of it, access it, get in on it, find a job with it, invest in it, all this sort of thing, is very symbolic of the economy moving forward. And people, rightly or wrongly so, are going to get louder and more angry about it.
Louder and louder and louder for
Yeah.
sure. So, after a period of historic rate hikes, which sectors or business models are facing the most acute adjustment and which is proven surprisingly resilient?
Yeah, so when it comes to interest rate hikes, obviously there's low hanging fruit of businesses that are going to be very affected by that initially. Real estate and housing, are quite difficult. I think a lot of things in the gig economy, this is Uber, DoorDash, Lyft, Uber Eats, um, were very dependent on cheap money, which they had for 10 years. And I think a lot of them are struggling now to make their business models make sense in an age when debt now costs money. Money costs money. And so, Uber rates are going up. Rates for all these things are going up because these business models were never terribly sustainable. The unfortunate reality is that this also may mean that some of these companies don't exist because people just simply can't afford the prices. So it's a hard thing. It's a very, very hard thing. But yeah, I would say housing, gig economy has lots of exposure. Um, Tech doesn't have much exposure because they have a lot of money. Retail has a lot of exposure. Any business that relies on a lot of debt is going to have a lot of problems.
A lot
And
of problems. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, here's the reality. We had coming out of 2008, which is why I call it the Long Depression. Coming out of 2008, we had not only a bailout for the banks, but we also had 13 years of quantitative easing, which was basically the government was either paying people to take money or not charging them to take money. And this went on, and the government would also buy bonds and do this sort of thing. And so we created an economy that was entirely based on cheap money. Then we got into COVID. We spent $5 trillion on COVID, and most of the rest of the world has comparable levels of spending. We spent tons of money on COVID to relieve the worst effects of it. And so in the US, we came out a decade of cheap money, a ton of money on top of that. And now we have inflation. Now the Trump administration has added tariffs. What does this lead to, everyone? Huge, huge costs, either from inflation due to excess money, i.e., too much money demanding too few goods and services, and then also having new taxes. And make no mistake, tariffs are not paid by the country or the company exporting, they're paid by the company and country importing. So when President Trump talks about all the wonderful tariff revenue we're getting, that's just coming out of Americans' pockets.
Mm.
Nobody in the rest of the world is affected by it. That only affects America's companies when we export to other countries, and they're importing, and their local companies and affiliates who are selling the goods are paying the taxes there. Tariff money doesn't move very far. It has very little velocity. All it basically is an extra tax from the pocket of people trying to buy stuff into the pockets of the government.
Mr. Cameron, let's talk about all your books. What is all about America's Lost Generation? Is this your latest book?
It is, and I have a copy of it right here, America's Lost Generation.
Yes.
Yeah, so it is ironically, it kind of gets into some of this stuff, but it has mostly to do, it's a book about millennials. It tells the story about millennials and how, the most educated, dynamic generation in American history never really got off the ground. And it gets into what happened after 2008, how the economy changed, how the world changed, how education became less valuable almost overnight. And it also juxtaposes that with what happened in Japan in 1991 after their property crisis, and how that shifted and changed Japanese society, and what the future and outcomes of that might be. Hint, hint, nothing good. And a lot of Japanese people never recovered from 1991, and now they're in their late 50s, early 60s looking for pension, and the Japanese government can't afford it because they never contributed. These are all problems that we'll be facing with millennials, who financially speaking are America's largest generation and only have 4% of the wealth. It's a quite the amount of money that has been sucked out of younger people, and this is now repeating itself with Gen Z. The amount of money getting sucked out of millennials and Gen Z is huge, and that's why people can't buy houses, they can't buy cars, they can't have children, they can't do the basic functions of life, because all the money is flowing upward. Remember, K-shaped economy. All the money is flowing upward and out of the pockets of regular people. If you wanted to get people buying houses, having kids, starting families, and living life, don't let Elon Musk 10x his wealth in a decade. He started out at a modest $2 billion in 2015, and it's now over 200. The bulk of that should have gone into the greater economy. If you had put that into the pockets of if you'd put that in the pockets of people through jobs, you would end up with new houses, new towns, better infrastructure, a larger tax base. More people paying taxes to make things good, better schools, more schools, because people would be having children. Whereas instead, all this money is flowing into the pockets of the people who, quite frankly, need it the least. And most importantly, I don't even begrudge them that, it doesn't move. It's going to flow into assets, stocks, bonds, debt instruments, all this type of thing. It's not doing anything for the regular person who needs a job. And this is why, honestly, this book is the first installment in something Thomas Piketty, who wrote a book called Capital, said in 2000, I think 10. In the 21st century, it will be far better to derive your wealth from assets than it will be to derive your wealth from labor. And owning assets, things that make money while you sleep, is going to be far more profitable than working a job and using your talents, be they physical, be they mental, to make money, because there's going to always be this downward pressure on wages in the same way we don't see it in assets. And that's because the wealthy put their money into those assets, whereas that money could have gone out into the regular economy. This dynamic has already existed, and it's just getting worse. And America's Lost Generation tells the story of how it started. It gives us another comparable story in Japan, and it kind of gathers all the thoughts together at the end of what has happened and where do we go from here.
Well, what happened, people? What happened? And thank you so much for sharing your book to the world, Mr. Cameron. How
Um,
about your second book, which is published? What did you publish? When this being
that
published?
that came out in 2020.
Yes,
Yes,
unfinished coloring book.
yes, an unfinished coloring book. It's a short story collection of short stories from myself. It also includes the exclusive release of a short story from my 1920s detective series called The RKO Killer. And it's just a collection of short stories. They're a lot of fun. There's one about a man who gets a lottery ticket for $50,000 and has to turn it in, but has all sorts of crazy hijinks trying to turn it in. There's a book about a diner closing due to the widening of an interstate. There's a story about the California housing crisis and how cheap apartments getting torn down affects people, and the stories of those people. There's even a story about a man who goes and kills his son's drug dealer, who sold him the drugs that he overdosed on. So I just kind of look around at the world and see what's going on and try to find ways to tell those stories. And this book is a collection of short versions of that.
Collection indeed. And let's go to your next book, which is, when did you publish this one, Mr. Cast Iron?
Cast Iron also came out in 2020, a couple months before an unfinished coloring book. And it It's about a young man named Randy Carruth who kills his stepfather with a cast iron frying pan for molesting his sister and his life afterwards. And it's set in Missouri, a state in America in the Midwest. And it after that the crime happens, he goes to prison for a couple years, gets out, falls in with kind of a bad crowd, gets addicted to drugs, sex, and more, and eventually escapes, reconciles with his mother, and tries to put his life back together. And the book ends with him going on to a different kind of life.
Interesting novel, Mr. Cameron. And before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, to the people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season. Abstract poetry in second season. I'm up book 101 review in fifth season too. Comedy 101 in the third season. And food 101 in fifth season as well. Geography 101, love letters. Movie 101, music 101 our fourth season. Science 101, Sex 101 in its second season of my baby podcast. Law 101, Mental Health 101, Bible Verses 101, and of course, Entrepreneur 101 coming this December. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Mr. Cameron, based on the trailing edges of a data you see today, what is one trend you are confident will be dominating headlines and a boardroom discussion 1 year from now?
I think 1 year from now, we are going to be talking about reindustrialization with a lot of robots and automation. I think that that's going to be something companies are going to figure out. You know, cheap labor is coming to an end, whether we like it or not. Globalization is coming to an end, whether we like it or not. Things are going to be coming back to different countries, but it's not going to be 50,000 people working at a factory. It's going to be several hundred and a lot of automation. And that I think is going to be the big story over the next year.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Mr. Cameron. Thank you, thank you. And can you
Thank
please
you.
invite our listeners to support your books, your advocacy, your podcast, or whatever projects that you're doing right now?
Of course. So you make sure to find me online on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Cameron Cowan, at Cameron Journal on TikTok, and Cameron L. Cowan on Facebook. But if you go to CameronJournal.com, as you can see right here, all the buttons are right there or up at the top. The Cameron Journal podcast airs 2 episodes every week on YouTube at Cameron Journal. And we have the Cameron Journal News Hour doing the latest headlines every Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern. So I look forward to seeing you there. And don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter, CameronJournal.substack.com.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Cameron Cowan because if you support him, for sure, more and more empowering advocacy will rise. So, Mr. Cameron, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.